By the turn of the century, the United States had become the leading industrial producer in the world. As job opportunities expanded, working conditions deteriorated, making the American workplace an environment of death and destruction. As immigrants flocked to the industrial cities of the East and Midwest, they found harsh working conditions in the factories and sweatshops. On March 25, 1911, a fire broke out in the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory, trapping large numbers of young immigrant women inside because the doors were locked. Panicked workers jumped out of windows to their death.
I saw the people throwing them out. I hollered, "Come on, come over here, maybe the door will be open." But it took a long time before the door came open. But the fireman came in, picked us up, and he took us down. A couple of firemen took us. And when we got down, we couldn't get out because the bodies were right on the ground there.
Well, the Triangle Shirtwaist led to the first workers' compensation legislation and the factory inspection legislation that brought the government into the business of protecting workers on the job.
News of the efforts of social reformers such as Florence Kelley to eliminate the sweating system or homework traveled from New York to Chicago. And it was in Chicago, while living at Jane Addams Hull House, that a young doctor named Alice Hamilton began to investigate the causes of industrial disease, which she later wrote about in her autobiography.
It was my experience at Hull House that aroused my interest in industrial disease. Living in a working-class quarter, I could not fail to hear tales of the dangers that working men faced.
After conducting numerous studies of lead-exposed workers, Alice Hamilton became the first doctor to correlate disease with specific occupations.
I was the only one who had seen the men working on the Scotch hearths in the smelters, emptying the bag house and flues, shoveling the white lead from the drying pans. How could I hope that a cold, printed report would serve to do away with these pressing dangers?
It was her close association with workers which led her to support the efforts of the Workers' Health Bureau. The Bureau, which was the first organization to bring workers and professionals together, insisted on trade union control of health and safety, but it recognized that unions could not change things by themselves. In 1919, Alice Hamilton became the first female professor at the Harvard Medical School. She accepted the appointment on the condition that she be permitted to return to Hull House for 6 months each year to carry on her investigations. Following her retirement from Harvard in 1935, she remained active in many social and political causes until her death at 101.
All I want's just food for my baby. Give to me my old job.
With millions of people unemployed during the Depression, jobs, even unsafe jobs, were hard to find. In 1931, over 5,000 men were hired to dig the Hawk's Nest Tunnel in Gauley Bridge, West Virginia.
It is critical that we remember and our children remember that in the height of the Depression, workers from all over the East Coast went to West Virginia to dig a tunnel. And that many of those workers were black workers is important. And that they dug that tunnel through pure silica. Hundreds of them dropped dead in their tracks at work and were buried on the spot. Silicosis was not a new disease in the 1930s. Union Carbide knew what it was. They knew what was killing the workers. If we had kept that story alive, if every third grader had learned what happened at Gauley Bridge, then maybe what Union Carbide did at Bhopal wouldn't have happened.
With the election of President Roosevelt in 1932, things began to change as the New Deal got underway.
I propose to inaugurate a definite long-range plan for dealing with all phases of public health and public welfare, which are a proper concern of the federal government.
The passage of the National Recovery Act created thousands of new jobs, and the Wagner Act made it lawful for workers to organize and engage in collective bargaining. It was this period that also saw the strongest expression of labor militance and resistance to the anti-union attitudes of employers.
Now, if you was a seaman that was union inclined, you had a hell of a job getting a ship. Especially if you're the one who protested against the rotten food they gave you, or the bum quarters, or lousy wages, or speed-up conditions. Hell, they immediately blacklisted you.
Over 4 million shipyard workers were exposed to asbestos during World War II, and they were not alone. Evidence of the known dangers of asbestos had been actively suppressed. It was not until 1964, when Dr. Irving Selikoff and his associates published a study of the Asbestos Insulators Union in Paterson, New Jersey, that the true story of the asbestos tragedy began to reach the light of day.
And there were 632 members who paid dues in 1943. And we simply tracked every one of them down to 1963. And we calculated how many should have died of all causes, of cancer, of lung cancer, of whatever, by 1963. And what we found was a disaster that is still with us.
Once Selikoff began to speak out against about the biological hazards of asbestos in the middle 1960s, he was attacked by industry.
They raised the question of shouldn't they speak to the trustees at Mount Sinai so that they could keep me quiet, and shouldn't they speak to the AMA?
They could do this because so many of his colleagues in the medical profession would not stand up and be counted. None of these people ever said a word about asbestos until it was so safe to do so that the problem had long been resolved by hundreds of thousands of people dying of incurable lung disease.
If not for Dr. Selikoff, I don't think I'd be sitting here today. But because at one point, all I thought was a safe workplace meant having decent ladders and decent weight on the draft coming out of the ship, and not being rushed to work too fast. How would I have known that the asbestos that I was working on could kill me?
We look at statistics, but we all know statistics are human beings with the tears wiped away.
Both wrongs is broke down. You spent your best days.
These green leaves cover the scars that these mines have made on these mountains. And you can't see down inside of their lungs the scars that this black lung has caused.
Company doctors uniformly failed to identify lung disorders as work-related. They reflected the coal company's views that workers were expendable.
They treated the mules better than they did the men because of the fact that the men they just paid with wages. The mules they had to buy. Doesn't matter what industry you go into, you can find it all over the place. Management doesn't give one good royal goddamn about the workers. They don't care.
United Mine Workers began to insist that there was a serious disease caused by coal mine dust and began to demand preventive action. But it was the walkout of over 40,000 coal miners in February 1969 that finally forced the West Virginia legislature to provide black lung benefits.
As usual, the miners did this for themselves. They were the ones that got it passed.
My daddy said, don't ever be a miner, for a miner's grave is all you'll ever own.
My father had to quit school in the 8th grade to go to work in the coal mines, and I tell you that's wrong. We had to go to company doctors when I was a child, and that's wrong. to the company preacher when I was a child, and I'll tell you that's wrong. And I tell you, we ain't going back there no more.
Never, never, never keep us down, oh no. Never, never, never keep us down.
With the passage of the Coal Mine Safety and Health Act in 1969 and the Occupational Safety and Health Act in 1970, the federal government was now mandated to protect worker health and safety on the job.
The act was a catalyst to a lot of empowerment that went on during the 70s. So the Occupational Safety and Health Act was historic in that respect, liberated a lot of energy.
16 ton, and what do you get? You get another day older and a deeper in debt. St. Peter, don't you call me, 'cause I can't go. I owe my soul to the company store.
And I've seen people working for safety. There must be a reason why. Maybe we just come to work here. We don't come to die. I would like to end up with all of my fingers. I don't want my brain to get numb. I'd like to have my ears when retirement nears. I'd like to hear that applause come. I'd like to see my grandchildren be able to pick them up if they cry. That's why I just come to work here. I don't come to die. 'Cause if it's always level on the floor where you're working and your telephone is OSHA approved, when you tell me how much you're spending on safety, pardon me if I'm not moved. 'Cause ever since 1970, the law has been on my side. That's why we just come to work here. We don't come to die. Now you and I know that the things that aren't code could be fixed with relative ease. But we never did get anything by asking on our knees. So now we're looking you straight in the eye, shoulder to shoulder and side by side. We're saying we just come to work here. We don't come to die. 'Cause if it's always level on the floor where you're working and your telephone is OSHA approved, when you tell me how much you're spending on safety, pardon me if I'm not moved. 'Cause ever since 1970, the law has been on my side. That's why we just come to work here, mister. We don't come to die.